During the 2005 Consumer Electronics Show, the world was introduced to the latest display technology and the birth of Full HD 1080p in the living room. While Blu-ray and HD DVD movies were still more than a year away, this new standard promised unrivaled clarity, representing the true next generation of high-definition television. Months later, at E3 2005, Sony unveiled PlayStation 3 in what would go down as one of the most infamous press conferences in gaming history. And by the time the console launched in late 2006, it was clear that many of those original promises had not fully come to fruition. Although the console would eventually find success, its beginnings were challenging. One of the key marketing points leading up to the release of PlayStation 3, however, was the promise of Full HD 1080p support for both games and movies. As we know now, however, such a high resolution was ultimately unattainable by most software. But surprisingly, this push was never completely abandoned, and 1080p games did indeed ultimately ship, but at what cost? So on this episode of DF Retro, we're taking a journey back through the PlayStation 3's library to discover and assess the games which did fully realize this 1080p dream. Over the course of this video, we'll check out more than 85 games running at or near 1080p, and rate each one on a scale of 1 to 1080p. Then at the end of the video, we'll determine which was the best year for 1080p gaming on PlayStation 3. As we explore the library, I'll be grouping games together by release year to help determine how well the system fared over the course of its lifetime. We won't cover every single 1080p game, but hopefully I can tackle most of them. So join me as we dive back into the first generation of Full HD gaming.
Meet the Cell broadband engine. It's the digital soul of the PlayStation 3. And though it may look like an ordinary microchip, it is the future. It all comes down to processing power. The faster you think, the more things you can think about. And that makes you smarter.
PlayStation 3 launched on November 17, 2006 in North America with 14 disc-based games plus 2 additional PSN exclusives. Of these 16 launch games, 5 offered support for Full HD 1080p, but this was just the beginning. Before we dive into these games, however, we need some additional context, I think. So 1 year prior to the arrival of PlayStation 3, Microsoft was first to market with its next generation machine, the venerable Xbox 360. And this console had already defined expectations for next generation gaming with a slew of impressive releases, including the then brand new Gears of War, which handily demonstrated the capabilities of Unreal Engine 3 that would go on to dominate the generation. It was clear that Xbox 360 was truly a force to be reckoned with. But what the 360 did not offer out of the gate, however, was digital video output. Early 360 consoles were limited to analog video only, and while 1080p over component video is possible in select cases, the system did not initially support this option. Now in 2007, an HDMI-capable version of the 360 was released, and 1080p was definitely on the table then. But when PS3 launched, no other console could boast true digital Full HD support. And I believe this is part of the reason why Sony focused so heavily on marketing 1080p. It was a differentiating factor. Problem is, the hardware itself didn't quite live up to expectations in terms of overall performance, and many early titles fell woefully short compared to similar games on Xbox 360. Launch titles such as Call of Duty 3 and Madden 07 both ran at half the frame rate of their 360 counterparts. I mean, just look at how awful Call of Duty 3 is on this system. Even small rooms like this trigger massive performance dips. It's dreadful. And this begs the question, was the PS3 just empty hype, or was there something more to it? It turns out the answer isn't so simple. So, as I mentioned earlier, the PS3 launched in North America with 5 games supporting 1080p output, 3 disc-based games, and 2 PSN titles. Also worth keeping in mind, if you see 1080p support on the back of the box, that doesn't necessarily mean it supports 1080p rendering. Many later PlayStation 3 games support upscaling from 720p or less. But before you even get to playing those games, the PS3 puts on a strong showing, with a true native 1080p dashboard featuring Sony's cross-media bar. The XMB had been used on PSP and certain other Sony products already, but the PS3 presents it at its best. It's super sharp, features pixel-perfect font rendering, and a smooth 60 frames per second update, along with plenty of neat features such as music visualizers, all presented at 1080p. The PS3 also famously supports Blu-ray disc playback. The first Blu-ray players had only become available in the summer of 2006, mind you, and it's clear that Sony wanted the PS3 to help drive the sale of Blu-ray movies just as the PlayStation 2 did for DVD. But of course, new consoles are all about games, and the 5 1080p launch titles actually did make a decent case for high-resolution output on PS3. The most prominent example is almost certainly Namco's Ridge Racer 7. I recently produced an entire episode of DF Retro on this era of Ridge Racer specifically, but the key point here is that Ridge Racer 7 expands upon the work done on 360's Ridge Racer 6 from the following year. It features improved visuals, more content, and you guessed it, support for native 1080p at 60 frames per second. If you were lucky enough to have access to a 1080p display in 2006, this was a real treat. The higher resolution was stunning to behold. While it's true that it lacked anti-aliasing and PC gamers were already used to high resolutions, full 1080p was still very new for console gaming. I feel that Ridge Racer 7 is a perfect argument in favor of conservative rendering features targeting higher performance. Ridge Racer 7 uses completely baked lighting, static environments, and well-worn rendering techniques. It kept pixel shader usage to a bare minimum and avoids things such as cascaded shadow maps entirely, something that would come to dominate this generation. It's focused completely on creating a simple, clean image that runs smoothly, and I feel this is one of the key reasons it holds up so well today. The art design gels with the fast performance and crisp image quality perfectly. Performance-wise, Ridge Racer 7 holds up with a generally very stable performance during gameplay. 60 FPS is the target, and that's what you're going to get in most scenarios. That said, there are occasional fleeting moments where you can dip the frame rate for just a moment, usually when combined with the boost feature. But thankfully, it's a minor issue, and overall it holds up very well. Ridge Racer 7 remains one of the finest examples of 1080p 60 on PS3, thus it receives the coveted Full HD award, all 1080p's. Another key 1080p launch game then is, and I quote, NBA 07 Full HD 1080p. Look, it's right there on the box. Are you really going to argue with that? Yes, Sony's first sports game on PS3 already serves as a strong example of what's possible when keeping your rendering ambitions in check. Like Ridge Racer before it, NBA 07 aims to deliver a native 1080p presentation running at 60 frames per second. It even warns you on startup that you're gonna need a capable 1080p TV and suitable HDMI cable to experience it. NBA 07 is the product of Sony's San Diego studio then, which was also responsible for the long-running MLB The Show series. And while it's visually conservative to say the least, they did manage to include some visual features that I think elevated above what was possible on last generation machines. For starters, player models are reasonably detailed and manage to feature normal mapped uniforms. But more impressive is the fact that they all have cloth simulation. Now, by today's standards, it's rather quaint, but for 2006, the way the shorts and jerseys bounce around as the players take to the court is reasonably impressive. This is coupled with planar reflections used on the court surface, with the surface texture itself using shaders to realistically distort those reflections across the uneven wooden surface. It looks pretty good, I think. Beyond this, the crowd is comprised entirely of fully animated polygonal models, which lends the game a more authentic atmosphere, and in the far distance, they even use depth of field, which both reduces aliasing and improves the cinematic nature of the presentation. Even the game's UI is rendered beautifully with full HD artwork everywhere that matches those visuals. It looks really shockingly good for the time. The caveat here is that performance is not 100% flawless. It does manage to stick to 60 frames per second most of the time, but you're gonna run into dips when the camera moves in certain positions, and that can be a little jarring. If you switch the game to 720p, however, all of these issues are cleaned up, but by then you've defeated the entire point of the game's subtitle. It's no longer full HD. So while NBA 07 is a convincing argument for 1080p 60 overall and an impressive launch game, the minor performance issues and occasional unflattering angles means a lower score than Ridge Racer. Thus, I give NBA 07 900 Ps out of 1080. One thing to note at this point in the video though, unlike the 360, PS3 doesn't automatically scale games to the desired output. You see, back in 2006, many HD TVs only offered support for 480p and 1080i input. 720p was not supported. The issue is that PS3's hardware scaler could only scale on one axis, the horizontal. So as a result, 720p games that did not offer 1080i or 1080p support would end up running at 480p on these displays instead. In the case of games which offer 1080p support, however, this also unlocks 1080i support for these TVs. Yes, it was frustrating and confusing at the time for many owners, but unfortunately, that's how it was early on. But the next real 1080p launch game then was one of the first downloadable PlayStation games ever released, and that's Blast Factor. It just so happens that this release is the very first game from Bluepoint Games, and it's a completely original one at that. Humble beginnings and all that, I suppose. So this is a twin-stick shooter with an interesting twist. You pilot a small craft through infected cells, so to speak, clearing these cells of infection as you go. Your path through each stage varies based on your performance, leading to various branching paths reminiscent of Darius from Taito. It also features motion control, allowing you to rapidly tilt the arena in one direction, causing viral particles to capsize in the process. And yes, as you can see, this one also supports Full HD 1080p running at 60 frames per second. While simple, the clarity and fluidity of the experience is impressive to behold even now. The number of particles and the interactive fluid sim really elevate this experience, and honestly, if you release this today on a modern machine, as a result of its simple art design, I think it would still hold up. Thus, this one gets 1000 Ps out of 1080. It's not quite on the level of Ridge Racer owing to its smaller scale, but what's here is very polished and impressive for a launch game. A sharp beginning for Bluepoint Games. But we'll be seeing them again later in this video. Our next 1080p game just happens to be the other downloadable PSN title that was available at launch, and it's called Cash Guns Chaos. I'll be honest, this is one of those games that I've never heard a single person ever discuss since launch day. It is basically a Smash TV clone at its core, but the art direction is, well, not especially attractive, I think. But I will give them some credit. The developers really went for it when it comes to resolution and frame rate. Like our last three games, Cash Guns targets 1080p native at 60 frames per second, and by and large, it delivers. It looks ugly as heck while doing so, mind you, but hey, it still reaches that target. That said, the performance is not 100% flawless, and it can exhibit drops in performance from time to time, but still. I'll be generous and give this one 714 Ps out of 1080. It hits the target, but the game is highly constrained and ultimately rather unattractive, so it can't play with the big boys. Honestly though, when you look at these first few titles, you could almost believe Sony's marketing when it comes to native 1080p rendering on the PS3. Each of these games targets true native 1080p at 60 FPS, and all of them manage to hold up today as a result of smart, though conservative, visual choices. Everything seems great thus far. That is, until you load up our next game. But first, it's time for a commercial break. This is Marvel's Ultimate Alliance, our fourth and final 1080p launch game for PS3, and as you can see, it's kind of a mess. So, Ultimate Alliance is the creation of Raven Software and was developed using Vicarious Vision's Alchemy engine. It first arrived in October across multiple platforms, including Xbox 360, the PC, PlayStation 2, the original Xbox, and PSP. The PS3 iteration, though, would launch a few weeks later alongside the new console. Now, the Xbox 360 version was the best looking of the bunch at launch, and the PS3 version is derived from it. The main difference is that PS3 supports native 1080p output. Unfortunately, it does not run well in this mode. As you can see, it averages out to roughly 20 frames per second, but often dips below that, going as low as 12 FPS in heavy sequences, and this is just the beginning of the game, mind you. For a title played from an overhead perspective with a significant amount of lateral motion, this renders the game nearly unplayable in my book. It feels awful to play. Here's the thing though, you can reduce the rendering resolution of the game by selecting different resolutions at the system level, and 720p is dramatically faster, more in line with the 360 original, while 480p is even better. Problem is, if you're using a 1080i TV, you would have been stuck with the same lousy performance as the 1080p mode if using HD output, so you were probably stuck with 480p. So what the heck is going on here? I can only offer some guesses, but let's try. As a first generation game, it's likely that Ultimate Alliance is not deeply multi-threaded, and it likely leans heavily on the RSX, the PlayStation 3's GPU from Nvidia. As we know, the PS3 is heavily bottlenecked by the RSX, which is less performant than the ATI chip used in Xbox 360, and many early generation ports reflect this. The secret to speedy performance on PS3 lies in the cell processor and its SPUs. As we know, many GPU-centric tasks could be offloaded to SPUs, but in 2006 it was still early days for this. Now, Ultimate Alliance makes use of many visual features that would become staples of this generation. Per-pixel lighting, normal maps, dynamic shadows, and more advanced particles. It looks pretty good, I suppose, for the time, but I believe it serves as a cautionary flag for troubled waters ahead, demonstrating what we could expect during the first couple years of PS3 multi-platform development. As a result, I give Ultimate Alliance a mere 200 Ps out of 1080. The fact that it's a launch title means that it deserves some credit, but it remains one of the worst examples of 1080p performance on the PlayStation 3. Beware. So at launch, it's fair to say that while things were looking pretty good from certain perspectives, games such as Ultimate Alliance and Call of Duty 3 served as evidence that something was awry with PlayStation 3 that would begin to rear its head more and more going forward. Remember, the PS3 was widely considered more powerful than Xbox 360 when it launched, but reality started to catch up with it and it wasn't quite so cut and dried in the end.